Hey everyone, I want to take a look today at the book Hurt and Healed by the Church by Ryan George. I was sent an advance copy for review, so I want to say thank you for sending that along, and this is my honest take on the book. I'll take you through my typical format of the main idea of the book, the research behind it, the readability of its style, and then just some of my reactions at the end. So Hurt and Healed by the Church is mostly a reflective memoir. But I was intrigued by it because of the hopeful, positive positioning of the book, like even that title, "Hurt and Healed by the Church," in the world of deconstruction memoirs and kind of church abuse, church trauma stories, of which many are being published right now. This just stuck out to me as having maybe potentially a different tone, so I was really intrigued by it, and that's why I wanted to check it out. And essentially, what it is it's Ryan George's reflection on his story of growing up in an independent fundamentalist Baptist, IFB, which is a specific acronym. You may be familiar with that, some of you who are watching this. He grew up in an IFB church that was very intensely fundamentalistic, and I would say from reading it, like just the tone of the church and the way people were taught and catechized in the church was pretty like spiritually intense and abusive just on that level. But there's another level to it, which is quite extraordinary in the extent to which his father, as the pastor of this IFB church he grew up in, his father was very specifically abusive to women. And the way, I don't want to give away too much of the story because it's kind of a wild story, but the way that Ryan found out about some of his father's infidelities and abuses and stuff is also really shocking, and I can only imagine was very like disorienting and traumatic for him as an individual. So he tells the story of growing up in that church culture, but then also learning about the damages and toxic effects of his dad's leadership. So there's a layer of like processing family trauma. There's a layer of processing the destruction in the church, and then all of the ways those things play off of each other. It's a story that's ripe for just a ton of emotional baggage. And so that's what he walks through and unpacks. I'll say more about this in a second, but he doesn't do it in a linear style. It's not just a start at the beginning and go through to the end memoir. It's very much cyclical and thematic, and he loops back to events. He doesn't tell the story in a straightforward style, but he loops back to certain reflections and recollections of events as they relate to the themes he's kind of getting at in the story that he's telling and the way that he's unpacking his spiritual journey. So that's what the book is all about. There's not a lot to say on the research side of it because it's a very kind of approachable conversational style that isn't research driven. That being said, he uses a lot of quotes from people like Diane Langberg. There's a couple pages at the end that are like recommended resources for further reading. And it's a really, for someone who grew up in a very like narrow, rigid, fundamentalistic culture, he's read quite widely since recovering from that. And so that list at the end is really good. It's a lot of good stuff. I haven't read all of it, but I read a good bit of what's on that list, and I can vouch for his reading is very wide and very thoughtful. And that kind of, he uses like quotes to introduce different sections of the book that come from all these different sources of people who have written wisely on church hurt and church abuse and abuse of power and spiritual power and whatnot. So that kind of suffuses the writing project, but it's not like a citation-driven academic book by any means. Now, the readability of the style of it is it's a very approachable style. Like I said, it's not meant to be heavy. It's not meant to be at all inscrutable. It's actually meant to be very inviting. The chapters are super short. They're almost like devotional length, like a devotional writing kind of style. Each chapter has its own. The book is organized into units, thematic units, and then there's lots of short chapters under each unit. So you could almost, because it's not linear, you could almost jump around if a certain chapter or unit looks interesting to you or particularly might resonate with your story. So I found it very readable, with an exception. I actually wish I wish the book was a little more linear in his story. And I'll get in, so actually that'll tee up my reaction. I'll just get into my reactions now. So the style is very readable, but I have some questions or maybe some quibbles with the structure, I suppose. But I'll get in my reaction now. So a couple things I want to say about this book. First of all, it is amazing, like just as an overarching comment, it's amazing what he has recovered from. Like it is just incredible what he has come from, and the fact that he is a Christian and the fact that he's part of a church, and he talks about this very honestly in the book, the fact that he's part of a church and practicing faith, I mean, it's like a remarkable thing, and that alone I think is worth a consideration, especially in the kind of spate of publishing on deconstruction and church trauma right now. This stands apart in the sense that he has one of the worst intense stories, and I've read a decent number of these kinds of memoirs. Like he's up there with some of the worst stuff, and he's still in the church. It's amazing. So there's that, and I want to say that up front. That being said, I wish the book was a little bit more linear in terms of the way he recounts his story. Because he loops back and because it's cyclical and because he kind of jumps in and out of the chronological unfolding of his story, it can be a little tricky to put the timeline together as you're reading through it. And I found myself a little bit confused a few times in terms of how the events all unfolded. That's maybe a quibble. I like the fact that it's a little more creative, actually. I like the fact that it's more about themes. But I do wish it was maybe a little bit easier to follow the story because his story is really gripping and really arresting. I also think that potentially, you can tell, and he has a little note at the beginning of the book, like he's tried really hard to protect identities of people because of how many people were hurt by his father's leadership. And so I think that might be part of what he's doing there, is trying to not air the dirty laundry too much. It's a really hard balance to strike in a memoir like this, so I get all of that. I maybe would have structured things slightly differently. And the other thing I want to say, so it's a positive tone. It's not cyclical, or it's not linear, rather. It's cyclical in the way the story unfolds. And it kind of does read like, and this is what I want to say in terms of a recommendation of this book. I think this would be a really, really good book for anyone who grew up in an IFB background, an independent fundamentalist Baptist background, or that kind of church. I didn't. I have friends who have, so I have some awareness of it. But my strong suspicion is that I think I resonated with pieces of a story and the kind of the courageous honesty he brings to this book. But I think I missed some of the deeper emotional resonance because I don't have exactly that background. But I really think if you do, or if you know someone who does, I think this book would speak powerfully to you. If you have a friend who grew up in an IFB church and is done and is just utterly jaded and has thrown it all out, this book might, if they're willing to crack it open, because of its positivity, because of its like honesty, and because of the intensity of his story, that you can't really read his story and be like, oh well, he didn't have it that bad. He had it as bad as anybody, and the fact of that means I think his story is worth taking seriously, and I think someone who's been hurt in similar contexts might experience some like. They would resonate with the story probably. They might experience some healing in terms of like, wow, someone really gets it and actually stayed in the faith. I don't know. I think there is an audience for this book in kind of that, people with that background. And I would commend it for people in that background and coming out of that culture specifically. If you've read a lot of these memoirs, I read this. I'm glad that I was exposed to his story. I think he's a powerful story. But I think I missed connecting with some of the pieces because of my background is quite a bit different. But that said, he stands out as also a memoir written by a guy. There's a lot more, at least in my overview and my reading of this literature right now, there's a lot more memoirs being put out by women, which I think is good, and I'm really glad for that. Like Kate West's memoir that I reviewed on this channel, for example, or Amy Bird's that I just reviewed as well. This one stands out in being... from that background, from a guy, from a male, from someone who is very actively in the church and acknowledges it's kind of a surprising thing. His story's captured here in kind of how that happened. It's quite an interesting reflection on quite a powerful story. If any of that sounds of interest to you, I would commend it to you. So those are my thoughts on Hurt and Healed by the Church, Redemption and Reconstruction After Spiritual Abuse by Ryan George. Thanks as always for taking some time to watch.